The country mourns the death and celebrates the life of civil rights icon Representative John Lewis. He was 80 years old. Lewis was the last surviving speaker from the 1963 March on Washington. He worked alongside the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as one of the Big Six leaders of the civil rights movement. As a student, Lewis organized lunch counter sit-ins to protest segregation. He then became the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. At age 25, Lewis led marchers across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, to demand voting rights for Black Americans. Police responded by beating Lewis and others mercilessly. The march became known as Bloody Sunday. Lewis's efforts are credited with leading to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 just a few months later. In his later life, Lewis served Georgia's 5th District in Atlanta for 33 years. He became known as the conscience of Congress, and he dedicated his career in public service to pursuing justice for marginalized people everywhere. CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe looks back at a legendary American life.
We still have work to do.
Congressman John Lewis was the youngest leader of the civil rights movement and its enduring storyteller. He helped organize the March on Washington in August 1963, and his death means there is no longer anyone alive who spoke that day.
We do not want our freedom gradually, but we want to be free now.
2 years later, Lewis led a march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama.
We're marching today from Selma to Montgomery. We are marching to our state capital to dramatize to our nation and to the world our determination to win first-class citizenship.
That ended abruptly at the bottom of the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
You are to move off of the street immediately.
This is an unlawful assembly. You are to disperse.
A day seared in the memories of most Americans as Bloody Sunday.
I was the first person to be hit, and I still have the scar on my forehead. And I was knocked down. My legs just went out from under me. I thought I was going to down this bridge.
As a college student, Lewis led sit-ins that helped desegregate Nashville lunch counters. He became a freedom rider, risking his life to force desegregation. He was there when Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. He was beaten, spit at, and over the course of his life, arrested more than 45 times, all for what he called good trouble.
I met Rosa Parks in 1957 when I was 17. 1958, I met Dr. King. And these two individuals inspired me to get in trouble. And I've been getting in good trouble, necessary trouble ever since.
Elected to Congress from an Atlanta district in 1986, he was a liberal Democrat who pushed for civil rights, gay rights, and boycotted 2 Republican presidential inaugurations.
I would ask that all of my colleagues join me on the floor.
Days after a mass shooting in 2016, Lewis led an unprecedented sit-in on the floor of the House, trying and failing to secure votes for gun control legislation. Throughout his life, he remained a living reminder of the legacy of the civil rights movement.
When people tell me nothing has changed, I just feel like saying, come and walk in my shoes. I will show you. I would take you to those places.
On Capitol Hill, Lewis was one of the few lawmakers left, universally admired on both sides of the aisle, in part for simple moments like this one. Last year, at the height of the impeachment fight, Lewis participated in a bipartisan tribute to retiring Georgia Senator Johnny Isakson, a Republican. Lewis ended his remarks with something rarely seen in Washington anymore. He crossed the House floor for a handshake and a hug between a Democrat and a Republican. In June, Lewis visited Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington. The civil rights icon stood on the spot of the new mural and said that it sends a mighty powerful and strong message to the rest of the world. Ed O'Keefe, CBS News, Washington.
Tributes to Lewis and his lifelong fight for freedom are pouring in. Former President Barack Obama posted a picture of the two of them embracing. Obama wrote, quote, "He loved this country so much that he risked his life and his blood so that it might live up to its promise." And through the decades, he not only gave all of himself to the cause of freedom and justice, but inspired generations that followed to try and live up to his example. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi called Lewis, quote, a titan of the civil rights movement whose goodness, faith, and bravery transformed our nation. Every day of his life was dedicated to bringing freedom and justice to all. And former Vice President and presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden said, quote, we are made in the image of God. And then there is John Lewis. He was truly a one-of-a-kind, a moral compass who always knew where to point us and which direction to march. Vice President Mike Pence also released a tribute which read in part, even when we differed, John was always unfailingly kind, and my family and I will never forget the privilege of crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge at his side on the 45th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. May God bless the memory of John Lewis, and may his example ever inspire. President Trump ordered flags at the White House and all public buildings to be flown at half-staff in Lewis's memory for Saturday. On Saturday, he also tweeted, saddened to hear the news of civil rights hero John Lewis's passing. Melania and I send our prayers to he and his family. CBS News Chief Congressional Correspondent Nancy Cordes joins us now. Nancy, good to see you today. How are lawmakers remembering Lewis after his passing, and how are you feeling knowing that that you spent so much time there at the Capitol and got to know him up close?
Well, thanks, Lana. You know, really an outpouring of love, affection, admiration, sadness coming from lawmakers from both sides. Steny Hoyer of Maryland said there's a hole in the heart of America today, and there's really a hole in the heart of Congress as well, because John Lewis, in many ways, even though he was a staunch liberal, he was really someone who transcended politics. He was kind of a moral compass for a lot of lawmakers, somebody who had obviously put his own life on the line time and time again during the civil rights movement, had been arrested 45 times, who still wasn't afraid to fight for what he believed was right, but really had a dignity and a legacy of the type that is rarely seen on Capitol Hill. And he really was admired by both sides. You know, you read that statement from Vice President Mike Pence talking about crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge with John Lewis. Well, Lewis went back to that bridge every single year for more than half a century, and he would bring Democrats and Republicans alike with him, invite them to cross the bridge with him, really, a symbolic gesture to try to bring the two sides together, to help newer lawmakers understand what it was that he and his fellow African-American activists had gone through, the depths of that struggle. And that's why you have individuals like Mike Pence who were able to forge this personal bond with someone who disagreed with them on virtually every policy issue. So he's going to be deeply missed by lawmakers and certainly by those of us who covered him as well and who knew him as someone who was very passionate about the issues, who didn't have a lot of patience for the silliness that goes on Capitol Hill, the squabbling. He really had his mind on loftier things, and he was very happy to talk about those things, not as eager to get down in the mud on the latest Twitter fight, really wanted to stick to the news, but who also frankly wasn't afraid to have some fun. You know, I'll never forget a couple of years ago when I was covering a rally in Georgia, Stacey Abrams running for governor, and there in the front row, waiting for her to come on, was John Lewis in his mid-70s dancing to Pharrell's Happy and really putting all of the youngs to shame with his moves. He was so exuberant. I was so startled by this sight that I whipped out my iPhone and started recording it. And that's just the kind of person that he was, very free to weep when he felt that the situation called for it, free to laugh, free to dance, someone who will be truly missed on Capitol Hill and around the country.
Well, we have heard conscience of the Congress always used when describing John Lewis. Nancy, do you know how he got that moniker? It seems a really appropriate one for him. Did it come from his fellow members in the House, do you know?
It did. And you have to remember that by the time he entered Congress, he was someone who had already cemented his place in history. He was elected by the residents of Atlanta in 1986, sent to Congress, but he had been nationally recognized for his bravery, for his passion, since he was 21 years old. He, helped to form the organizations that led the freedom rides, that led the lunch counter sit-ins. He was the youngest person to speak at the March on Washington. He, 2 years after that, ended up leading this march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge that would go down in history as Bloody Sunday. So he was someone who had been willing to walk the walk. He had been beaten repeatedly, arrested repeatedly, and kept going back to fight for these issues that everyone now recognizes were righteous and just, but for which he met so much resistance at the time. And there really was a dignity about him that was forged in these conflicts. And so he came to Congress with a kind of moral authority that is very difficult, a gravitas that is very difficult to earn once you're on Capitol Hill. And I think that that's why lawmakers turn to him time and time again.
One of those moments where he was speaking out as the conscience of Congress recently had to do with school shootings and gun control. Leading that sit-in, I remember you covering that as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about why he fought so hard for that and how he felt ultimately not having been successful in achieving that gun control legislation in his time?
Right. Well, this is an issue that has obviously animated a lot of Democratic lawmakers for a very long time, and they feel they really haven't gotten anywhere on the issue. So it is incredibly frustrating to a lot of them. And Congressman Lewis decided to take it a step further one evening, a big surprise to all of us. He decided to organize a sit-in on the House floor. Now, that may not sound like a big deal. There are sit-ins all over the place all the time, but that's against the rules of the House. So you just don't see something like that happening, certainly not instigated by a member of Congress. There are all kinds of rules that dictate what you can say, what you can do on the House and Senate floor, what you can wear, and he decided to violate those rules, and a lot of Democrats followed his lead. And he has talked time and time again about the fact that this is really his North Star, is the idea of nonviolent protest, peaceful protest, and that he doesn't worry about getting in trouble, what he calls good trouble, when he does it because he feels that he's on the right side of history. In fact, he once famously said that the reason that he smiled in one of his early mugshots was because he knew that he was on the right side of history. So he's sometimes willing to take risks that other lawmakers might not be. In that particular case of that sit-in, he wasn't successful at the end of the day. He was trying to impose upon Republican lawmakers to vote with Democrats on gun control legislation. Republican lawmakers declined, by and large, to do that. So that was an effort that didn't pan out in that moment. But I think what Lewis might argue is that that's the whole point of peaceful protest, is that you go back and try again until you achieve what you believe is just. And I think it's just something that not a lot of lawmakers would have had the courage or the idea to do. in Congress, and I don't think many lawmakers would have followed just about anyone else if they had turned to their colleagues and said, hey, let's go ahead and do a sit-in. But because it was John Lewis, they were motivated to do that. I can think of one other time where he motivated his fellow Democrats to follow him down a somewhat risky road, was when he decided that he was going to boycott, essentially, President Trump's inauguration. He said he didn't believe that President Trump was a legitimate president, and therefore he wasn't going to attend the inauguration. And that was something that was quite controversial, and it was very difficult for a number of Democrats to decide what to do. But once Lewis announced that he wasn't attending, then you had dozens of others who said that they wouldn't attend as well. And so, rightly or wrongly, it shows you the kind of influence that he had among his fellow Democratic lawmakers.
Never afraid to shy away from a fight. Nancy Cordes, thank you.
You're welcome.